30 minutes or so. I'll cover a little bit about some of the sort of fundamental aspects of nutrition, look at some of the kind of key things around, what nutrition can do for you as athletes, why it's worth paying attention to. We'll look a little bit around the kind of aspects of nutrition that are important, look at some of the macronutrients, which we'll come on to, and then talk a little bit about sort of fueling as well. So just as a brief introduction to me, my name's Ben. I've worked in sports nutrition for probably the best part of 15 years now. Whenever you're sort of listening to anyone for nutrition advice, it's always important to make sure that you get it from people that are kind of suitably qualified and educated in this area. So my background is I've got an undergraduate degree in sports science. I've got a postgraduate diploma from the International Olympic Committee in sports nutrition, and I've done a master's degree in sports nutrition as well. I've spent a bit of time as a rider myself. I used to race cross country and enduro in the elite category many years ago. So I've had some experience of what it takes to be an athlete, and pretty much made all of the nutrition mistakes you can make by myself. I spent a bit of time in the labs and within sort of research as well. So I've got a good understanding of the science behind nutrition as well. And then for the last kind of 5 or 6 years, I've run my own sort of coaching business. In the last kind of 6 months, I've also secured a role in the world tour, working as a nutritionist for Soudal Quick-Step. So I like to think I've got kind of a fairly broad background, the experience of both being an athlete, the science, and how to apply it. So hopefully I'm worth listening to this evening. As I say, my kind of main current role is as a nutritionist within Soudal Quick-Step. So most of my days are spent kind of supporting that. I run my own sort of coaching business, which I have done for the last kind of 6 or 7 years, working with private athletes, paying from a whole host of different levels. And one that's potentially of interest to you guys as well is alongside a friend of mine who's another nutritionist. We run something called Fuel the Ride Academy, which is a sort of online course designed for predominantly cyclists, to provide sort of education and coaching around sort of sports nutrition. So if you're interested in sort of learning a bit more about nutrition, then I'd certainly send you to the Fuel the Ride website. So as I said, the first bit I'm going to cover is looking at sort of introducing a bit about sports nutrition, why it's worth paying attention to as an athlete, and what it can potentially do for you in terms of your performance and your progression as a racer. So when we look at performance nutrition particularly, there's kind of, broadly speaking, there's kind of 4 categories in which it can have influence on you as an athlete. First and foremost is around your health. The diet that we eat plays a key role in keeping us healthy, supporting our immune system. Things like our bone health are really important. So, our diet plays a really key role in supporting that, helping us to, fend off illness and infection, so that we don't lose a lot of time, training time or competition time to, being ill or having injury. If we do get injured, it can help prevent injury. Being able to concentrate in the bunch after a heavy race can be influenced by what you eat. And equally, when you do get injured, nutrition can also play a role in helping to get you, back on the bike as soon as you can. One of the really interesting areas for me is around sort of training adaptations. So this is adaptations are what occur when you do a training session. So, for example, if you go and do loads of sprints, you might, one of the training adaptations might be that you grow bigger muscles to allow you to produce more power and go faster in those sprints. So, every time you do a training session, it sort of it creates a stress on the body, and how the amount of stress you can create, and also how your body responds to that stress can be heavily influenced by what you eat before, during, and after your training. And this is a really interesting one, because potentially you're by optimizing your diet or eating the right things at the right times, we can effectively help the body to get more out of the training that we're doing, and potentially allow for a quicker increase in performance, or get us to where we want to be faster. There's the performance aspect, which I'm sure many of you already know if you're doing any sort of competition, and that's around the influence that our food can have on our race day performance. So things like our fueling and our hydration can influence our ability to perform when it comes to race day. So this is all around sort of using different nutrition strategies to, help you as an athlete achieve your full athletic potential on race day. Now, admittedly, the food you eat, isn't going to suddenly turn you into a world tour rider, but certainly for many of us, if we get this wrong, don't fuel enough or don't hydrate well enough, it can turn a very good athlete into a very poor athlete very quickly. So another really important aspect of nutrition. And finally, probably least importantly for many of you guys as well, is around sort of body composition. So our diet obviously has an influence on the amount of fat we have in our body, the amount of muscle we have in our body. Things like our bone density are influenced by the diet we consume. For you guys as junior riders, one of the major changes that's going to occur as you progress into the kind of senior ranks is you're going to ultimately gain more muscle mass, and obviously the nutrition, what you eat around your training, is going to have a big influence on how quickly you gain that muscle mass and where you end up. So that's a kind of brief overview there of where nutrition can have influence. And when you consider that every time you have a meal, it can have a positive or a negative influence around, the training that you're doing or the competition that you're doing. When you consider that over the course of the day that you might eat, with kind of meals and snacks, you might eat 6 times a day. That's 6 opportunities per day to use food to influence your performance, your enjoyment, your progression in your cycling in a positive way. Over the course of a week, that's 42 different meals, and over the course of the year, that's over 2,000 opportunities in which you can utilize the food and drink that you consume within your diet to help better support you as an athlete, and help support your progression and your performance. So even relatively small changes, fueling a little bit better around certain sessions, or having better recovery strategies in place, can have a big influence on your development as an athlete over time by making small changes over a long period of time. So one thing that's that's really important to bear in mind with nutrition is to be able to see the bigger picture and look at the sort of, be aware of what the important components of diet are, what you should really be paying attention to. In the world of social media and online sort of news stories and stuff, it's very easy to kind of get caught up in aspects of nutrition that maybe aren't very important, and often this can potentially distract from more important strategies, or you may not have the sort of some of the really sort of fundamental basic strategies in your nutrition strategies in place to support your performance. So when we look at sort of what are the key aspects of nutrition for an athlete? First and foremost is around the total intake, and this is what we're talking about in terms of the total amount of energy you consume within your diet. So making sure that you're eating enough on a day-to-day basis is potentially one of the most important factors when it comes to performance, training adaptations, health, and body composition. So just making sure you're eating enough and not too much and not too little is ultimately a really important kind of component of diet. Next up, we have the macronutrients. So macronutrients are, macro is large, and nutrients is obviously providing nutrition. These are the kind of nutrients like fat, carbohydrate, protein, and water. They're things that we consume in relatively large volumes. They provide us with often quite a lot of energy, and these are quite important within our diet in terms of we'll come on to a little bit more about them later, but things like making sure you're eating enough protein, making sure you're eating enough carbohydrate, making sure you're eating enough fat, and drinking enough are really important to ensure you're able to perform and perform well. Next up, we have the micronutrients. So these are the kind of micro, small amounts, things like iron, calcium, magnesium, nutrients that we consume in relatively small quantities. We're talking compared to something like protein, where you might consume, 1 or 200, 100 to 150 grams, or carbohydrate, where it may even be, as high as 5, 6, 700 grams on a day. Micronutrients we typically only consume in very small quantities. So we're talking, fractions of a gram. But many of these play really important roles in both our health and our metabolism, and are again an important component of the diet. Next up, we have sort of meal timing. So making sure that we sort of time our meals around training sessions, for example, to support what we're trying to do in terms of training. And last and probably very least in terms of the impact that it's going to have on our overall health, performance, training adaptations, and body composition is around supplements. I know most of you guys on the call this evening are relatively junior cyclists. You're under 18s. Generally as a nutritionist, I'd say that, supplements probably shouldn't even feature within your diets at the moment. We should be really looking to maximize, the fundamentals around, fueling well and recovering well before you sort of, even consider sort of supplements. We almost think of them as the kind of sprinkle on top of the cake. They make a very, they have a very small influence in terms of performance, when compared to, other strategies like making sure you're fueling enough. So hopefully that's a nice sort of broad overview of what to do. Effectively, what we want to end up doing is not doing what this guy's doing, which is thinking about dealing with the sort of more important components of our diet. So as you can see here, the guy's mowing his lawn while his house is on fire, so he's not particularly dealing with the most important issue there. And this is how many athletes typically approach their diet. They're eating enough, making sure you're getting enough sort of fuel in to support your training, or making sure you get enough of the macronutrients is the house on fire. It's the bit that often gets forgotten about, but is really important. And then, many athletes focus a lot of their time on things like supplements, which may not provide, a great deal of benefit, particularly when it's in the background of a poor quality diet, or a diet that isn't sufficient. So yeah, just moving on a little bit to some of the macronutrients. So I'm sure this probably isn't new for many of you if you've had a reasonable interest in nutrition before, but I'll touch on these very briefly before we go into a little bit about the fueling side of things. So as I mentioned previously, macronutrients are the nutrients we consume in relatively large quantities. So things like fat, carbohydrate, protein, and water. So protein we get from a whole host of different food sources. They can be broadly categorized as either plant-based, or animal-based. So animal-based is obviously things like your meat and poultry, your seafood, your eggs, your dairy, your tofu and tempeh. And then we obviously got your plant-based stuff, which is like your beans, pulses, peas, chickpeas, lentils, peanuts, almonds, those kind of things. Grains like quinoa and oats, and bread is potentially a source of protein as well. Protein plays a really key role within the body in terms of providing the sort of building blocks for repair and recovery. So, for example, muscle is made up of a whole combination of different amino acids. So we need to consume protein within our diet to provide our muscles with those building blocks to allow the body to rebuild and repair muscle, which is, as athletes, is a really key tissue to focus on. It's one that gets a lot of attention within nutrition and performance, because it's obviously vital for our ability to produce power and race competitively effectively. So and the protein we consume within our diet not only has a role in providing the building blocks, but also consuming protein is a trigger for muscle repair and recovery. So it's a really important component. There's also other roles of protein in things like supporting immune cells so that we can fend off illness and infection and recover well. A lot of sort of other sort of things like red blood cells, for example, are made up of predominantly protein, and the protein within our diet plays a really key role in supporting the the growth and building of new red blood cells, which are going to be really important for processes like getting oxygen to your muscles, which ultimately have a role in performance. So protein is arguably probably one of the most important nutrients for endurance athletes to consume, and really plays a key role in sort of supporting training adaptations particularly. Next up, we have carbohydrates. I'm sure if you're a cyclist, you hopefully already know what a carbohydrate is. We get it from a whole host of different sources. You've got your kind of starches, which are your kind of complex carbohydrates, so to speak. Your things like bread, pasta. Your more sort of slow digesting carbohydrates, and then we've obviously got things like sugars, which comes fruit and confectionery products. Obviously, your energy products are generally considered pretty much pure carbohydrates. Carbohydrates not only play a key role in providing a fuel source for the body. The carbohydrate is the predominant fuel source that our muscles use, but also plays a role in health. So things like oats, for example, provide fiber, which is really important for our digestive health and fueling our microbe, which has a role in things like the immune system and supporting our overall health. We'll come on to the carbohydrate a little bit more detail later on, because it is such an important one when it comes to sort of fueling athletes during things like racing. We have a relatively limited capacity to store carbohydrates. So, as athletes, you may be able to store around about 400 to 600 grams of carbohydrate within your muscles. There's something called glycogen, and we also have another store of glycogen in our liver, which looks after our blood glucose, and that's a much smaller store. So typically a well-trained endurance athlete may only have in the region of 2,000 to 2,500 calories worth of energy stored as carbohydrate. We'll come on to this in a bit more detail later on, but effectively when our glycogen stores get low, we become fatigued. It's often called bonking, blowing up, hitting the wall, when either our muscle glycogen stores or our liver glycogen stores get low. And this is part of the reason carbohydrate gets so much attention, is because it plays such a key role in supporting our performance. So we'll touch on that a little bit later on. Fats we get from a whole host of different, again, food sources. Things like your seed oils, olive oils, rapeseed oil. Oily fish like salmon and mackerel. Things like dark chocolate, avocado, nuts and seeds, and your full fat dairy products. Fats again play a really key role in providing an important fuel source. It's a very dense store of energy, so it allows the body to store a lot of fuel very efficiently. Even a relatively lean athlete, so if you were, say, 70 kilos and had about 10% body fat, which is very lean, you would still have in the region of 70 to 80,000 calories worth of fat stored within the body, which is enough to do back-to-back bike races for probably a week on end before getting anywhere close to even depleting those stores, which is obviously in contrast to carbohydrate, which we have a much lower amount of a much lower capacity to store. Fats play a really, not only providing a fuel source, but play a really key role in health. A number of hormones like testosterone, which plays a key role in muscle growth. Excuse me, is predominantly made up of the fats that we consume within our diet. There are a number of vitamins and minerals that we can only get through dietary fat sources. So they're what we call fat soluble vitamins. And there are a number of sort of essential fatty acids, which are fats that we need these nutrients within our diet, and we can only get them from foods that contain fat. So fats are again another really important component, macronutrient. We obviously then have water as well. I won't touch on that too much, but obviously one of the major sort of macronutrients. It's different in the fact that it doesn't provide any energy. It's there for a whole host of other processes. So just moving on to the final bit, we'll touch a little bit on fueling for performance. Going back, as I mentioned previously, carbohydrate is a really key fuel source during exercise. So what we tend to see is that when we exercise at low intensity, so when we're riding along, we're not working very hard, we're able to chat away to our friends next to us, ride at a pace that doesn't cause a great deal of stress or fatigue. What we tend to find is that at those lower exercise intensities, we're able to fuel quite a large proportion of that intensity with the fats that we have stored within our body. And obviously that means that we can, at those lower intensities, we can go on for quite a long time, because it's not limited by the availability of fuel. As we get to, this graph here shows us, this is from a lab study where they've measured people in a lab at rest, 40% of their max exercise intensity, 55% and 75%, and looked at, when they're expending energy. So obviously the harder they work, the more energy they're expending, and looked at the different combinations of fuel sources that they use during that time period. So, as you can see at rest, they're mainly using free fatty acids, so that's fat, and a little bit of glucose from the blood. As exercise intensity increases, you can see the black bit, which is other fuel sources. So this is like fat stored within the muscle, and the other free fatty acids. So fat is making up, probably over 50 or 60% of the fuel contribution at those lower exercise intensities. The sort of the sort of greeny top box, and the white one is carbohydrate. And as you can see, as exercise intensity goes up around sort of mid exercise intensities is where we tend to rely quite a lot on that's where our sort of fat burning is at its highest, and then we're still relying on a bit of carbohydrate. But as exercise intensity goes up, because fat is a harder fuel source for the body to break down, it requires more oxygen, it's less efficient, we tend to rely more on carbohydrate as a fuel source when we're doing higher exercise intensity type work. So as soon as you start doing efforts within a race, or you start working harder on the bike, where it feels harder, you're having to take more regular pauses for breath if you're trying to hold a conversation, we become more reliant on carbohydrate as a fuel source. And the significance of this is that we only have a relatively limited capacity to store carbohydrate. So if you think of these kind of bars here as the different amounts of carbohydrate we can store, a highly trained athlete, so someone like a world tour cyclist, for example, when they're carbohydrate loaded, so they've had lots of carbohydrate in their diet to fully top up those glycogen stores, they can store in the region of around about sort of 600 to 700 grams at the very most of carbohydrate, only about sort of 2,000 to 3,000 calories worth of carbohydrate in total. If we're well trained, we can probably store a little bit less than that, maybe sort of around the 400, 500, 600 gram mark. If you're sort of relatively new to cycling, it's probably less than that. So the better our training capacity, well, the better our sort of athletic ability, the greater that our capacity to store glycogen. And as I say, we've got quite a limited store of it. If we were to get someone from the audience now, if we assumed that their glycogen stores were pretty full up, and got them to exercise on a bike for as long as they could, we'd probably only have about an hour or two, maybe a little bit more, before they got to the point of kind of depleting those, running out of those glycogen stores within the body. And we know that when we get to sort of very low levels of glycogen, that's typically when we start to fatigue, and that's when our performance drops off a cliff. We blow up, we bonk, we hit the wall, we stick it in the granny ring, and crawl our way to the nearest petrol station to go and pick up a Mars bar and a can of Coke to try and get some sugars back into us. So that's the significance of glycogen. Obviously, it's something we have quite a limited capacity to store. So a big kind of a key aspect of performance nutrition as an athlete is to try and make sure that whenever we're doing competition, or trying to do high quality training where we're going to do any sort of intensity or work hard, we need to make sure that we have adequate amounts of glycogen within our muscles before we start that activity, to allow us to do good quality work, perform well, and train well to do it. So a big focus in sports nutrition is around sort of making sure these stores are topped up before exercise, trying to maintain carbohydrate intake and availability during a session, and then after a session is about trying to kind of recover those glycogen stores back to where they need to be, ready for the next session or the next day of competition. So one thing to be aware of, and again, part of the reason why carbohydrate is so important when it comes to performance is, if we were to have three different people in the audience tonight, if we had fed one of you on a low carbohydrate diet for the last kind of 24 to 36 hours, someone on a moderate carbohydrate diet, and then someone on a really high carbohydrate diet, and got you all to, assuming you're all exactly the same in terms of your level of fitness and your athletic ability, what we typically see is if we were to get you on a turbo trainer tonight and set you off at 75% of your maximum, what would generally happen is that the person on the low carbohydrate diet would probably fatigue pretty quickly. Maybe after an hour, 90 minutes, they wouldn't be able to maintain riding at that intensity. If you'd been on a moderate intensity diet, you might be able to go for an extra hour and a half, 2 hours, maybe 2.5 hours. If you had been on the high carbohydrate diet, you may have been able to go for as long as kind of 2.5, 3 hours. So it's when we're trying to compete in races that are beyond a few hours in duration, it becomes really important to try and maximize our glycogen stores before the session, or at least make sure we've got enough glycogen within our body to support that. So generally, when we sort of one of the challenges as cyclists, particularly, is that on a day-to-day basis we can have quite big variability in terms of our energy needs. First and foremost, so we can have as cyclists we can have maybe rest days where we don't actually expend a lot of energy. Those could be days at school where you just don't have the time to get out and ride and train, and therefore a lot of those days are spent kind of resting. You're not doing huge amounts of expenditure. So, the energy needs on that day are relatively low. It may be these are just kind of figures that I've plucked out the air for illustration purposes, but they may be around, many of the World Tour cyclists that I work with, a rest day, they probably only need about 2,500 calories. But then that's in contrast to maybe, a weeknight where you might get out to do a Zwift ride, or, an hour or so. Now the weather, we've got sort of better evening light, you might be able to get out for an hour or two of an evening, and obviously that has increased needs in terms of our total energy intake for that day. So we need to eat more to support that training load. And obviously it's a lot greater than what it would be on rest day. And then we may also do things like at the weekend go out for a club run or a 4, 5, 6 hour ride, where our energy needs are again through the roof. We're in the middle of the classic season at the moment. We often have riders at the moment expending in excess of 8,000 calories, and that's kind of 4 times what their needs would be on a rest day. So one of the key challenges as a cyclist is making sure that our diet kind of matches those needs on a day-to-day basis. So one of the key things we tend to do is our protein needs. So you can see the protein in the bottom here is relatively the same. We want to make sure that we're getting a good intake of protein in throughout the day, making sure we've got some at breakfast, lunch and dinner, maybe an additional snack throughout the day. Our fat intake we want to keep relatively similar throughout the week, having those high quality sources that I illustrated on the slide. And then one of the key things that we want to be changing on a day-to-day basis is our carbohydrate intake. So using that extra carbohydrate that we're using to fuel those bigger days, to make sure that we're eating enough energy to meet our energy needs, and providing enough fuel to support those sessions well. So how do we do that? Probably one of the simplest ways to kind of get on top of your fueling as an athlete is to think about it from a plate perspective. So when you are doing easier training days, so maybe the days where you're not expending as much energy, when you look at your plate of a lunchtime or of an evening, or just thinking of your meal generally, we want to be prioritizing some source of high quality protein during that meal, to make sure that you've got enough protein coming in to support the repair and recovery of that meal. We want to be thinking about the carbohydrate content. Now as I illustrated on this, on the easier days, our carbohydrate intake obviously isn't anywhere near as much as it would be on those kind of heavier training days. So on these sort of easier days, we maybe reduce down the portions of our sort of our carbohydrates, our rice, our pasta, our potatoes on our bread, on the meal. Maybe reduce our intake of sugars, for example. and actually maximizing our sort of intake of things like vegetables and fruits, because these are, these allow us to kind of consume a large volume of food without a huge amount of energy. They help support our health and our performance, and help to mean that we can sort of still eat quite a large volume of food without having to take on loads of energy. We can obviously have additional drinks and things like oils and nuts and seeds to get those high quality fat sources in as well. Now, when we're doing sort of more maybe on those kind of moderate days where you're doing sort of maybe an hour or two of riding, on those days we want to be thinking more about sort of adding a bit more carbohydrate into those meals. In particular, maybe adding a bit more carbohydrate in the meals before and around that training session to make sure you've got the fuel available to do those sessions. Maybe even taking on a bit more carbohydrate in the session itself, maybe some sort of oat-based bar or a banana, or a crumpet or a bagel before that session or during it, to get some more carbohydrate in, and sort of compensating for that increased intake of carbohydrates by a bit less kind of fruits and veggies, to smaller volumes of those on the plate. And then on those kind of harder training days, maybe adding in more snacks throughout the day to get more of that sort of fuel in and more of that energy. Again, maintaining that intake of protein, reducing your sort of intake of vegetables down, but then prioritizing the intake of those kind of carbohydrates, maybe adding in some additional snacks or desserts or starters around your meals to get that extra carbohydrate in to support those kind of needs. So just getting these kind of fundamental strategies right, thinking about how your meals are being put together based on the demands of your training, can go a long way to kind of dealing with those sort of basic principles around making sure you're eating enough and making sure you're eating enough of the macronutrients to support your needs. So, as junior athletes, if you can kind of get these strategies in place, you're a very long way to, you're probably 70-80% of the way there to absolutely maximizing your nutrition as an athlete. So with that, thank you for listening for the last 30 minutes. If you've got any questions, I can stay around for the next sort of 10-15 minutes and answer any questions that you might have. Obviously, I've kind of, hopefully I've given you some new information there, but yeah, I'm happy to kind of cover more advanced questions if anyone has them. So yeah, thanks for listening.
Oh, thanks for that, Ben. That was really, really interesting. I'm sure we'll have quite a few questions, and I'm sure quite a few of them will be to do with ride fueling. I had a couple of the boys asking before the session about that, so I'm sure.
All good then, Maddie.
Plenty. Oh, here we go. Here's one from Hugh. Should you reduce how much you eat by a lot on a day after a race?
All good then, Maddie.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Perfect.
Cool.
Hugh's just asked, should you reduce how much you eat by a lot on the day after a race?
If you aren't doing much training. Yeah, great question, Hugh. To be honest, when it comes to sort of racing, generally what you'd look to do is try and sort of fuel up fairly well the day before a race. So you would actually probably have a bit more than a bit more energy than you actually need the day before a race to kind of make sure that those glycogen stores are fully topped up. Generally, I'd probably go a little bit on things like hunger after the day after a race. Often, racing can put the bodies under kind of quite a significant amount of strain. You're doing efforts that you maybe aren't replicating in training. You may be doing more hours on the bike on that day, and you can really, that additional stress can increase our energy needs. So I would not necessarily reduce your intake the day after. You're maybe not sort of trying to fuel in the same way that you did on the race day if you go from a 2-3 hour race to not doing a lot the next day. But certainly if you're finding you're very hungry the day after a race, it's kind of a good sign that your body's telling you need more. So in that case, I would certainly be eating more and trying to support that recovery and adaptation adaptation. We often get a case that our, things like our basal metabolic rate, so our energy our body requires at rest can be elevated, 10-20% after a race because of the extra energy it needs to recover and adapt from that session. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question. I don't mind reading these straight out, Maddie, if yeah. So Ben, does your body absorb all carbs consumed or only a certain percentage? Yeah, great question. We do have a sort of a limited capacity to absorb it. I mean, particularly during a ride itself, because our digestive systems are under additional strain because your body's trying to get all the blood to the muscles, which are doing a lot of work at that time period. It depends a little bit on the types of carbohydrates you consume. So if you were to, consume crazy amounts, we're talking like over a kilo worth of carbohydrate, which, I wouldn't necessarily recommend. You may not absorb all of it. So some of it may come out. Yeah, you might not get 100% digestive efficiency, so to speak. So you might not absorb all of it, and some of it might end up in the toilet. But yeah, it's how much you absorb is going to be a little bit dependent on the type of carbohydrate. So your more sort of processed carbohydrates, your sweets, your white breads and stuff, you'll probably absorb more of that compared to if you're getting your carbohydrate from more sort of whole grain sources like oats or things like fruits and vegetables where there's more fiber and it's harder for the body to extract that. So during exercise, I mean, generally we're probably only absorbing, the maximum we can probably absorb is around about 90 to 100 grams at the very, very limit, really, unless you're sort of a very top end elite rider. So again, hopefully that answers your question. So Ollie, if I have a 1 hour mountain bike race, do I need to take a gel during it? If I'm drinking carbohydrate? To be honest, for a race that's 1 hour in duration, the focus should really be on making sure that you're kind of well fueled before the race. Any additional carbohydrate you take on during the race is not going to provide a great deal of benefit. So if you're racing on a Sunday morning at say 11 o'clock, I'd be focusing on making sure you're eating a bit more carbohydrate in your evening meal the night before, getting a good breakfast, maybe even thinking about it from lunchtime the day before, just to maximize those kind of glycogen stores, to make sure that you've got enough fuel going into that race and not having to worry about fueling at all. I'd probably avoid the gel altogether. It may be, generally if it's going to be a 1 hour race, it may be quite intense. You may not have a lot of opportunity to take on a lot of fuel. So maybe immediately before, but yeah, generally the key strategy here is to focus on the 2 or 3 meals before the event to make sure you've got enough glycogen to get through. Owen said, what should you eat a week before a race to build up towards it? Yeah, great question. To be honest, really we should be, when it comes to racing, we're only really looking at the sort of day or two before to sort of fuel up for it. You probably don't want to be adding in too many sort of new foods. So trying to make sure your sort of your meals around racing particularly are things that you're well accustomed to, you've eaten before and haven't caused you any issues. Generally the day before, you want to be eating a little bit more carbohydrate just to make sure you've maximized those glycogen stores. But the rest of the week, pretty much just eating as you would in normal training. So, prioritizing that protein intake throughout the day, getting those high quality sources of fat in and making sure that sort of, you're eating enough carbohydrates to meet your needs and generally that you've got a high quality diet. You're eating lots of minimally processed whole foods, high quality ingredients that can help support your training and recovery. Ted, how much carbohydrate would you recommend to consume in racing and training? Yeah, it's a really good question. It's quite a difficult one to kind of answer in a few minutes of answering a question. As I say, it really depends on the demands of the session. As I say, those kind of plate models that I gave you previously are a good kind of rough template to aim for in terms of the sort of overall carbohydrate. Overall sort of needs, thinking about it on a meal by meal basis. I mean, often just, having a bit of focus around eating a bit more carbohydrate on those kind of heavier training days and a bit less on those easier training days can be a long way to go towards it. If you're talking about sort of during the session itself, again, it depends a little bit on the demands of the session. Obviously, the harder it is, the more carbohydrate you're going to burn, so the more you need to fuel it. If it's a lower intensity session, you maybe don't need as much. During racing, it's going to depend on the intensity of the racing, the duration of the racing. Obviously, the longer it is, the more intense it is, the more you're going to have to think about fueling. The logistics of things can come into it as well, in terms of where you can actually feed and fuel, how much you can actually consume on the bike. It's probably a bit of a broader question, that one. Ivan, is it? How many grams per hour should we be having in a road race versus a crit? So as I say, with something like a crit where it's only an hour long, really we want to be focusing more on the 2 or 3 meals before the race to make sure we're well fueled. If you're sort of relying on, if you've not had a lot of carbohydrate before the event and then you're relying on that gel to get you through it, then that's kind of the wrong way round. Glycogen is really important for performance. So I'll be focusing more on that side of things. With something like a road race, again, it depends a little bit on the duration. If it's only an hour and a half, 2 hours, you probably don't need as much. Maybe 30 to 60 grams is enough if you're of carbohydrate per hour. If it's a longer race, maybe a 3-4 hour race, then you might push it up as high as 60 to 90 grams, depending on what your individual tolerance is, what the demands of the event are, and how important it is, and what you've ultimately what you've got used to in training. Ollie, how soon before my race should I be having breakfast? Should I be aiming for 3 hours before? Great question. It depends a little bit on the logistics of the day. So we generally want to be prioritizing sleep as much as possible, because that's a really important aspect of recovery and preparation for an event. Obviously we want to not be having to wake up at 3-4 in the morning if you've got an early race, because that's the optimal time to get a meal in. Really, it will depend a little bit on how big a meal you're looking to consume. So, if you're if you have 3 hours, you can potentially have a bigger meal compared to if you've only got 1 or 2 hours. Typically, we can actually get on top of a lot of the fueling the day before. So if you've actually put in a bit more of the fuel intake the day before a race, you don't necessarily have to have as big a, you don't have to cram in loads at breakfast to make sure you perform well. Generally, if we top up our muscle glycogen stores the day before an event, those aren't going to go anywhere overnight. So you can wake up with kind of legs full of glycogen and lots of energy. So breakfast is really only there to kind of provide a little top up and make sure you're not too hungry going into the event. But equally, we want to try and manage it so that you're sort of arriving at the start line of your race, having, fully topped up your glycogen stores, but equally have a stomach that's relatively empty. So when, if you're doing something like a cross-country mountain bike race, you're not, where it's going to be fast from the gun, you're not suddenly sort of, having stomach problems because you've had this massive meal there. So, generally sort of 3 to 4 hours before is a good time to do it if the logistics allow. If it's if it's an 8 o'clock race, I probably wouldn't recommend getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning to have breakfast. I'd maybe, get up at 6 and have a slightly smaller breakfast. But 3 to 4 hours before is a good time to do it. And have again, sort of your typical sort of pre-race or pre-heavy training, pre-training meal. So it's something you're well accustomed to and know works for you. Iran, is buying and mixing maltodextrin and fructose to make up carbs in a bottle better than the big brand carbs in bottles? As someone that's worked in the supplement industry for a few years, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but effectively, you can buy maltodextrin and fructose powders in health food shops. You can buy it online relatively cheaply. Table sugar, for example, is something called sucrose, which is a combination of a sucrose molecule is a combination of glucose and fructose joined together. So when that hits your stomach, it becomes glucose fructose. It gets broken down into glucose and fructose. So you don't necessarily need to spend £5 a sachet on Morton energy drink mix, you can get you can get exactly the same results from table sugar effectively, or maltodextrin and fructose if you can get a hold of those powders. A lot of the research out there, Maddie's been to Birmingham University, where a lot of research has been done around carbohydrate mixes for performance, and a lot of the time in those kind of situations, they'll often use things like table sugar to do those investigations. So if you can find a mix that you practice with in training and it works well for you, then absolutely fine. The only thing I would say is that obviously as you guys progress through the ranks, you will have there will come a time where you're potentially subject to because you're in a competitive environment, you're subject to you're potentially subject to random drugs tests, or at least you need to abide by anti-doping principles and rules that are set out by organizations like British Cycling. And as an athlete, you have a responsibility to ensure that anything you ingest is free from banned substances, and there can be a risk to taking supplements in terms of some products can be inadvertently contaminated with banned substances because of production processes. So you may have a company that sells a maltodextrin powder. They source that from a factory that also deals with anabolic steroids, for example. There can end up being cross-contamination, and sort of that can effectively mean that you can end up with as you say, this is probably more aimed at high-level athletes, but it can sort of cause sort of inadvertent doping, as it's referred to, where you can end up ingesting something you don't expect, because it's so we generally look for, if we're going to use any sort of supplements as competitive athletes, we need to make sure it's got something called the Informed Sport logo on, which basically ensures that the manufacturer has gone through a process to demonstrate that they have taken their due diligence to ensure that their production processes are adequate to avoid that cross-contamination, and also the products get tested to make sure that they haven't got any banned substances in effectively. So to be honest though, with any sort of obviously you can make your own sports drinks using effectively table sugar and squash, so you don't even necessarily need to leave the house to get hold of those ingredients. Things like bananas, raisins, rice cakes, Rice Krispie cakes, where you melt down marshmallows and put in Rice Krispie cakes, Rice Krispies effectively. A lot of these things are going to effectively do the exact same job as many of the off-the-shelf products, often be tastier, and can be just as effective from a performance perspective. If you have a look at my Instagram, Ben Price Nutrition, I've done a few posts on various food products out there that can be as effective as as a lot of kind of off-the-shelf energy products. So hopefully that sort of answers your question there. I mean, as I say, a lot of things like the kind of maltodextrin fructose thing, for those of you that don't know, that's basically allowing you to take on more carbohydrate, because maltodextrin, which is broken down to something called glucose, and fructose have different transporters in the stomach and allow you to consume, absorb more carbohydrate per hour. If you're using just purely glucose, it's around about 60 grams. If you use maltodextrin fructose, it could be as much as 90 grams. Effectively, if you're only at sort of 60, 70 grams an hour, you can rely on a lot of more sort of normal food sources. Even your Haribo is just as effective as any sort of sports nutrition product. Probably tastier, probably cheaper, and I know personally what I would choose if I was competing these days. But that's the last question. So it's time for my dinner, I think. So thank you for listening, guys. Hope that was useful. If you've got any questions, you can find me online. Do go and check out Fuel the Ride Academy, and all the best with your seasons.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Ben. It's really good to hear from somebody who's had so much experience and has so much knowledge to share on this specific topic. So thank you for that. And I'll see you next week, guys.
Cool. Thanks, Maddie. Catch you in a bit.
Yeah, see you later. Bye.
Cheers, guys. Bye.